Hello and welcome to today's virtual class. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about the empirical rule. You've seen some pre-class videos on this already and we've talked about it a little bit in class, but it's kind of a tricky topic and I think it deserves a few more examples. You might remember this picture that I've drawn here from class. The idea behind the empirical rule is that if we have a data set where the overall shape or distribution of the data is symmetric and mound-shaped, so kind of this classic bell curve distribution that I've sketched out here, and we know the mean, mu, of the data set. So I'm just going to remind you, the symbol mu is a population mean, and the symbol sigma is a population standard deviation. Then we can estimate roughly how much of the data from that data set will fall within a given number of standard deviations from the mean. So here in this picture, I've said that if I start at the mean and then I go up by one standard deviation, in between those two values, I'm going to have about 34% of my data. And if I start at the mean and I go down one standard deviation, I'm going to have another 34% roughly of my data. So in an interval, a range that goes from one standard deviation below the mean up to one standard deviation above, I'll get about 68% of the measurements in my data set. Following kind of a similar argument, if I go from two standard deviations below to two standard deviations above the mean, I'm going to grab most of my data, 95%. And if I go from 3 standard deviations below to 3 standard deviations above, I'll grab 99.7% of the measurements in my data set. I'd expect only 0.3% of all of the measurements in my data set to be more than 3 standard deviations distant from the mean. By the way, if you see the phrase nearly all of the data in a homework problem, that's probably getting to that 99.7% number. So to capture nearly all of the measurements in a data set with a symmetric mound-shaped distribution, start at the mean and go 3 standard deviations below the mean and 3 standard deviations above. You'll be able to grab 99.7% of your data. We're going to illustrate the empirical rule with an example, and in the next video, I'll go deeper into this example and do a little more with it. So this is just to get us started. We're going to take the example of dentists in the US and how much local anesthetic they use in a week. A study found that dentists use an average of 79 units of local anesthetic per week. That average is my mean, mu, that I have here in my picture. And it looks like we have a standard deviation, sigma, of 23. The empirical rule says, now that I know a mean and a standard deviation, I can make some estimates about what percentage of dentists do I think are going to fall within a certain range. So, for example, let's say I wanted to give a range of values where I could say about 95% of dentists use between this many and this many units of local anesthetic per week. How could I do that? Well, I'm going to look up at my picture and I'm going to see 95% here looks like I need to go from average minus 2 standard deviations to average plus 2 standard deviations. So let's try that. So my solution here is I'm going to calculate an interval or range of values. My lower endpoint or smaller value will be mean minus 2 standard deviations. And again, I figured out 2 standard deviations from the diagram here up to mean plus 2 standard deviations. So this will be my lower endpoint, and my upper endpoint. Let's plug in some numbers. Here I have my mean, I said was 79, and my standard deviation was 23. All right, let's plug those numbers into my formula. My interval now becomes 79 minus 2 times 23. Right, so 79 gets plugged in for mu and 23 for sigma, up to 79 plus 2 times 23. I'd like to simplify that just a little. You could plug this into a calculator, but sometimes I think it's nice to write out the steps. So I have 79 minus 46 up to 79 plus 46. And that simplifies it down to 79 minus 46 gives me 33. And then 79 plus 46 gives me 125. So pretty big range of values. Getting back to my original question, my goal was to find a range of values where I could say 95% of dentists use between this lower number and this higher number of units of local anesthetic per week. And so I can plug the 2 endpoints of this interval into the blanks up here and get 33 to 125 as my range of values that's going to cover 95% of dentists, assuming this mean and standard deviation are accurate. So there's our first empirical rule example. With this, I think you'll be in a good place to start tackling the worksheet. But in the next video, I'll do some slightly trickier examples. So if you start the worksheet and you find yourself getting stuck, give that video a try. See you there.